Hello and welcome everyone. Really happy for you all to be joining us and to be talking about this book together. I'm Amy Knight. I am a fourth-year PhD student at University of California, San Diego. And today we will be talking about Rebecca Elliott's book, Underwater, Loss, Flood, Insurance, and the Moral Economy of Climate Change in the United States. And as many of you know, or might know, this book received an honorable mention for the Alice Amsden Book Prize. So really excited to be talking about it here today. Let's just dive right in since we got a little bit of a late start. So our panelists today, hold on. Our panelists today, well, first we're going to have Rebecca talk a little bit about the arguments of the book, and our panelists today are, also welcome, Rebecca. Thank you for being here with us. A little bit thrown off my game here. So our panelists today are Max Besbris. Hello. And we have Caleb Scoville and Stephanie Barral here with us today. All right. So Rebecca, if you could get us started with some remarks and an introduction or overview of the central arguments of the book, that would be great. And we'll do maybe like 7 to 10 minutes instead. All right.
Sounds good. Good morning. Thank you so much for the heroic technical efforts here. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person. I actually am in Amsterdam. I'm 10 minutes down the road from you, but what was it, yesterday morning before I set out to attend the first session of this fabulous mini conference, I tested positive for COVID. So fortunately, the hotel I'm staying at has these private workspaces, and that's where I am this morning, joining you via Zoom. There's also, I don't know if you can tell, there's photos of Marilyn Monroe on the wall. I didn't see the decor. But anyways, I mean, the most crushing blow of this whole thing is that I haven't been able to take part in this really, really exciting mini conference, and was really looking forward to hearing more about what some of my colleagues are up to when it comes to the critical social sciences, climate change. So I hope that everyone has been enjoying the mini conference, and I'm very, very sorry to have missed out. Let me also, of course, just say thank you so much to all of you for being here. Thank you so much to Amy for reaching out with the idea to do an Author Meets Critics. It had not occurred to me to be an advocate for the book in that way. So thank you so much. I'm really honored that you would take the time to do it. And thank you, of course, to Caleb, Max, and Stephanie for taking the time to engage deeply and thoughtfully with the book. It's really no small thing to serve in this capacity. It takes time, it takes energy. Those are things that are very much in scarce supply as it is. So I'm very humbled, a little bit intimidated, but mostly just feeling extremely fortunate to be able to have this conversation with 3 people whose ideas and work has been so instructive and generative for my own. Okay, so I'll spend a few minutes just to give you an overview of the book, and I'll try to keep this brief. Of course, in one sense, Underwater is a book about the United States National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP for short. If you haven't read the book, I wouldn't necessarily expect you to be familiar with it. All you really need to know at this point is that the NFIP is a public federal program that underwrites the vast majority of flood insurance for homes and small businesses in the U.S. So perhaps not what you'd expect from the U.S., a place that really prefers its private markets, that there would be a public option, and that this is really the primary option for most people. Okay, so flood insurance, pretty niche topic. At the start of my career, I certainly did not imagine that I would ever write a whole book about it, or anything for that matter. So I arrived at the NFIP through something that I saw unfolding in New York City after Hurricane Sandy in late 2012. So in the months after that storm, after the floodwaters had receded, after New Yorkers had started to rebuild and repair their homes in order to get back to normal, many of them at that point learned that they may no longer be able to afford to insure their homes. So the flood risk maps for the city have been updated, as have the rules that determine the price of flood insurance, which are set at the national level. So these were changes that, taken together meant annual premiums were set to increase in line with this new picture of the risk. So in some cases, for some people, that meant really steep increases really quickly. One man in Rockaway, Queens, one of the boroughs of New York, told me that the new NFIP math and the higher premiums that they made possible were, quote, scarier than another storm. So what he and others like him were worried about was a kind of wave of foreclosures if people couldn't afford to pay their new rates. And then the question was, who would buy these risky homes with these huge flood insurance premiums attached to them? They did have the option of keeping their premiums lower if they elevated their homes above the height of the expected floodwaters, but this was a really expensive proposition. This cost around $100,000 in New York City. So some families had to confront this really scary possibility of being priced out of their homes and neighborhoods and losing tremendous value on their most important assets, their home, their house, in the process. And at the same time, the losses they were facing were not only things that could be calculated in dollars and cents, they were the loss of a sense of security, a rhythm of life, connections to a community or a history, and the stable meanings that root a sense of identity and belonging. All the while, many people had gotten back to normal. They'd rebuilt exactly the way they were before, which of course leaves them vulnerable and exposed to the next catastrophic flood, which recent experience and climate science give us reason to expect will become a regular fact of life in many parts of the US. And of course, there was deadly flooding in New York City just within the last year. So the natural disaster had passed. Of course, we know there's no such thing as a natural disaster, but what we recognize as the quote-unquote natural disaster had passed. But then in its wake came this economic adjustment, one that was having real effects for people. And that's really when I started to learn more about this strange program, the NFIP. So I learned first that it's actually a very old program, though today it features in a lot of policy conversations and in media descriptions related to climate change. It was established by the US Congress long before climate change was an object of concern in 1968, when private insurers could not be convinced to sell flood insurance on their own. They couldn't do it profitably. So the NFIP, again, is a public federal program. It's currently run by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is responsible for mapping the nation's flood zones and for setting the price paid for a flood insurance policy. I also learned that the NFIP is a hugely beleaguered program. It's been billions of dollars in debt to the US Treasury since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It's largely failed to prevent continued building and rebuilding in harm's way, which was a big part of its founding rationale, this idea that a risk-based price of insurance would enable rational economic calculations that incentivize people away from the water's edge. It really has not done that. It's also forged unexpected alliances, so Democrats with Republicans, conservatives with environmentalists, homeowners at risk with the very building and real estate interests who could be blamed for putting them at risk. So the book tells the story of the flood insurance program through a variety of types of qualitative data. The data collection started in New York City after Sandy, but I followed the story ethnographically into New Jersey, down to Washington, D.C. I tried to kind of turn up at the sites where flood insurance was discussed, interpreted, and debated. I tried to get as many kind of angles of view on the program, so I interviewed not just policyholders, some of whom became activists of a kind, but also environmentalists, federal and city officials, elected politicians, floodplain engineers, risk modelers, lawyers, and insurance professionals, and others. And then there's a kind of major archival part where I read congressional transcripts and reports from the 1950s through the present. So the general approach of the book is to understand flood insurance as an institution that people have different ideas about, and that frames social action in interesting ways, but also as an experience that involves complex and conflicted decision-making. So as I learned more about the NFIP and all of its works, to put it mildly, it came into focus as analytically useful in a particular way. So ultimately, I think that the way into some bigger questions about the politics of climate change starts from specific practices and knowledge infrastructures. So more specifically for my purposes, this means that economizing institutions like the NFIP which take physical features of the landscape and turn them into dollars and cents, provide a terrain for witnessing how social actors work out in however tentative, however provisional a fashion, a bunch of different dilemmas. So these are dilemmas related to threats to public finances, the viability of private profit making in real estate development, the future of coastal and riverine ecologies, the condition of housing markets, and the viability of different ways of life. So the upshot of studying the specific practices and knowledge infrastructures of an institution like the NFIP is that insurance is a terrain upon which people fight about loss. And you may be thinking, well, of course, insurance is about loss. Insurance is the institution for managing loss. You pay premiums to secure compensation for expected losses. But here in the book, I examine and I think about loss in a more capacious sense than the one endemic to insurance, because I found that there are losses at stake here that are not only financial, but are also social and emotional, losses that can't be compensated, and so instead are resisted or mourned. And what's relevant to people as they confront loss in this kind of fuller sense are questions about what is fair and valuable, what needs protecting and what should be let go, who deserves assistance, and whose vision of the future should be used to govern the present. And there are no answers to those questions, but there are settlements, and they have huge social and material implications. Reforming flood insurance, I ultimately came to see, involves negotiation about who can live where, for how long, and on what terms. So as I studied some of the historical and contemporary conflicts around the NFIP, the various actors I encountered in this story could not talk about what was wrong with the flood insurance program or what needed to be made right without talking about what is fair, prudent, just, deserved, or equitable. So claims about flood maps, about risk classifications, price of premiums, these are conversations that are often couched in a language of kind of scientific objectivity or accuracy or economic necessity. But they always draw upon a backdrop of normative commitments about what states, markets, and individuals can or ought to do. So in a deeper sense, I wrote a book about flood insurance because I ultimately came to see the NFIP as an opportunity to think through the moral economy of climate change in the US. And by this I mean that, it's of course a site for witnessing the entanglements of moral ideas and claims with the economic arrangements that govern our lives. But in a broader sense, the NFIP participates in shaping the kind of problem that climate change is considered to be in the US, as well as who is responsible for addressing it and how. So I argue in the book that from the NFIP, we can appreciate that the thorniest challenges when it comes to the problem of climate change loss are unsettled and unsettling questions of responsibility for loss, justification of loss, and compensation for loss. So questions about what caused loss or who can be held accountable for loss. To what extent is climate change responsible for flood loss? And if it is responsible, is it appropriate for a homeowner who purchased a house in a flood zone 20 years ago to bear that cost today? Debates about justification of loss involve contemplation of whether some losses are inevitable or even desirable in a wetter world. Perhaps flood insurance should price people out of risky areas so they can be returned to nature. Or perhaps this kind of sacrifice is unacceptable or impractical. People disagree about that. And whose losses are we talking about? Is this people losing their only home behind the Mississippi River levee or their second home on the beaches of the Carolinas? And concerns about compensation for loss range from what people in flood zones can fairly expect from taxpayers outside of them, to whether compensation should be making it possible to rebuild homes in harm's way, to the limits of money as a way of compensating the losses that matter to people. So I'll leave it there. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much.
Love. All right, lovely. Oh, good. You can see me here. I was like, unfortunately, you can't see the whole room. We just clapped for you. Okay, so we're going to have Max come first as the first panelist. And I think maybe just stand here because the microphone is here for the panelists. And then at the end, when we do Q&A, I guess, I don't know, we'll figure it out. Yeah.
Thanks. I am very happy to be here for a few reasons. This is the third time that I've read Underwater in preparation for this. You all haven't read it, although I assume a lot of you have. You absolutely should. Colin Jeromack, in a recent review in Contemporary Sociology, said that this is perhaps the best book in sociology written about climate change so far. I would actually not qualify it as perhaps. I would say it's the best book I think that I've read about climate change, even though that's not its actual empirical subject on its face. But I'll get into that in a second. I just want to sort of first outline why I'm so happy to be here talking about this book. I think it was actually at SASE in 2015 when Rebecca and I first met. And at the time, I actually really did not have any interest in studying flooding or climate change or insurance or disaster. But as I became more familiar with Rebecca's work, I realized that I think she was presaging something that is an incredibly necessary shift for social scientists more broadly. And that is that global warming matters no matter what your particular area of empirical focus might be. A rapidly changing climate affects every aspect of society. And so I think we all have to come to study the environment in the way that Rebecca does. So I want to thank Rebecca, since I think Underwater and her work more generally has really provided a great model for how to integrate concerns about climate change, certainly into my own research agenda. I'm also very happy to be here because Underwater is not just a great work of environmental sociology, but I think for understanding economic action. The book really effectively moves from explaining the emergence of flood insurance in its particular institutional arrangements to showing the on-the-ground effects of these arrangements. So the subsidization of flood insurance since its inception means that any changes to rates and premiums to bring them more in line with predicted risks is experienced by property owners as an attack on multiple levels. It's an attack on their finances, certainly, but it's also an attack on their way of life. This is why one of Rebecca's respondents, as she mentioned, described the rate adjustments as scarier than another storm, which is also the title of a very great paper by Rebecca. And I think these accounts from her respondents and her analysis shows the essential truth that why things are valued and priced in a particular way has to do not only with the institutions that are doing that work of valuation, but also with the beliefs about worth that underpin these institutions. So the value of something like continued residence in a particular place is intersubjective, turned into objective, right? And when the seemingly objective substantiation of this value, which is the price of living in a particular place changes, right? So your premium is going up. I think it can reveal, as it readily does in the book, the moral claims to commodification more generally, right? So if we're thinking about economic action, I think what the book really does is show this wonderful through line from these broader macro concerns, right, about morality and institutions to the effects, right, as people experience them when they are doing the work of having to decide whether or not their homes are worth what other people are saying they're worth. Lastly, I'm really happy to be here because Underwater provides, I think, a really great directive for helping deal with some of the problems that it actually explores. Many of Rebecca's respondents didn't know they lived in floodplains. Others knew, but did not know that their flood insurance rates were very heavily subsidized. And while the counterfactual, right, is somewhat difficult, we can imagine a world where these residents make different choices with different information. But they haven't. They've been living in these properties for years with little concern. Individual homeowners' choices are so constrained by institutional forces and financial factors. So if the state allows a property developer to build in a particular place, if those homes that are built, that are developed, are affordable to me and provide me with the kind of amenities that I expect, and I am not alerted to the risks, then on its face, right, it's seemingly rational for me to live there. And isn't it rational for me to, if I play by the rules, right, pay my premiums? Shouldn't I expect this asset to grow, right? This is certainly the ideology of homeownership in the United States. I think the problem with all these decisions that I'm outlining, right, is that they're produced socially, obviously, but they also have collective effects, even though it's an individual decision that I'm making to buy this property, stay in this property, and hold on to it even after it is revealed to be extremely risky. underwater shows that better, more comprehensive information is key, I think, for helping mitigate future loss from flooding. But while political debates are often framed in the way that I just described, right, which are, is a particular individual acting rationally? Are they getting what they're owed? And are they being treated fairly? That's not really the level at which we should be considering benefits of better, more comprehensive information. Rebecca writes in the conclusion, we could rely on information about increasing risks and costs, not chiefly to influence individual decision makers who have to manage their own resilience, but rather to inform massive investments in decarbonized, safer, and affordable housing for all. And I think this is quite right. And I wonder then if the idea of insurance needs to become obsolete in general. So the book, I think, perhaps sometimes overemphasizes the moral power of insurance. So the NFIP, it argues, is an expression of certain moral values of collective well-being and societal support. But these values clearly aren't universal, as she shows in chapter 4. Even as better risk information proliferates, battles over the proper role of insurance rage on. And so I wonder if insurance is really a useful frame at all for mitigating future flood loss or loss in general. The best information we have about risk tells us that we need a total overhaul of the economy and retreat from huge swaths of currently inhabited land. So instead of thinking about how to fairly distribute this risk, could we not think instead about redistributing wealth in ways that decouples individual homeowners' financial well-being from where they live? So to put this another way, if we decommodified housing, wouldn't the need for insurance decrease and managed retreat become easier? Now, obviously, these aren't topics that, have to be addressed in the book, but I'm curious what Rebecca thinks. And I think a good rejoinder, right, to this claim would be that, well, even if we made mobility financially feasible and frictionless, we'd still be asking people to move away from their homes, right? The thing that grounds their daily life, that gives them a sense of place and identity, connects them to important networks of support. And asking or telling them to leave, could be seen as extremely unfair. I think this is true, but we do have examples of solidarity in managed retreat. The town of Valmeyer, Illinois, is often held up as one. After a severe flood in 1993, the town collectively decided to use FEMA funds to move all of its structures 2 miles higher away, higher ground from the Mississippi. And insurance was not part of that solution at all. So are we limiting ourselves and possible solutions when we focus too much on efforts to improve the NFIP or other insurance programs? The last thing I'll say is, something that stuck in my mind about the book and about the development of the NFIP is the logics about the sort of relationships of development to insurance. So much of the work that Rebecca cites in the book explains development as the product of growth machines, right? Local coalitions of various civic leaders and rentiers who seek to profit from making more housing and expanding local jurisdictions. More recent work that, like the growth machine perspective, sort of has a kind of Marxian, tinge, has critiqued past work for not paying enough attention to racism, racial capitalism, and the ways that race underlies valuation in place in the United States. So my question is about race, right? It seems to me that insurance, which I think Rebecca shows is sustained in part by moral claims regarding keeping value of homes high for those who have played by the rules, is therefore also linked to race, because race dictates development and value. The question of which places are deemed worthy of insurance, to me, likely also is a question about race in the United States. So what actually gets insured? We know that flood insurance is skewed towards homes that cost more, for households that have higher credit scores, in whiter communities. And again, you cite work on how housing development and housing policy is racially unequal, but to what extent did or does this racial inequality infuse the design and implementation of the flood insurance market, if at all? That is, I think, one of the sort of, like I said, the kind of thing that, just I return to again and again as I was thinking about the book. But overall, I think, like I said, everyone should read this book, no matter what your interests are, whether they're in climate, whether they're in the environment, whether they're in economic action or insurance. I think this is a great work, very deserved of the awards that it's been winning. And I just want to thank Rebecca for giving me the opportunity to comment on it.
Thank you, Max. Now we'll have Stephanie and then Caleb afterwards.
Hi. Hi, my name is Stephanie Barral. I'm a French social scientist at the National Research Institute of Agriculture, Food and Environment Studies in Paris. And first of all, I want to thank you, Amy, and thank you, Rebecca, to invite me on commenting this great book. I have to say that I also really enjoyed reading it, and I was also quite impressed by the amount of work and empirical work that's inside. First, I want to say that it appears to me as an important book for two reasons. First, I think it's important for the story it tells in itself about the increasing climate risk that we face and that we will face in the future, and the collective puzzle that it leads to. But I also think it's an important book for the big questions it raises and the future research questions it points at the crossroad of economic sociology and environmental issues. So I will reflect on both these points in the discussion. So first of all, the choice of climate insurance also appears to me as a very creative choice because it allows to link areas of environmental sociology that remain largely segmented otherwise in other maybe pieces. Elliott's proposition is well balanced, if I can say, that exploring what is solidarity in a changing biophysical environment, leading her to pay attention first to how our society is embedded in their environment, increasingly conscious of what it means and what it involves to be embedded in this broken environment, and second, paying attention to what it means to make society, faire société, as we say in French, when the biophysical grounds start disappearing, addressing the question of how to remain an integrated social unit when resources and fundamental needs are not ensured to be covered anymore. So in Underwater, Elliott succeeds in holding together both a story of institution, rules, calculations, and a story of ordinary people with their emotions, their fear, their strategies. And I think this is an important point because to some extent, the focus of environmental sociology seems either oriented toward understanding what are institutional answers to climate and environmental issues, or focusing on ordinary people, collective action, alternative ways of life, but rarely manages to grasp so well as she did together environmental change, regulations and policies, and the related ordinary experiences of citizens. So holding together these two dimensions of the story, Elliott shows us how climate insurance policies remain a very top-down and centralized approach to climate issues management. Throughout its history, the structure of the NFIP remains close to its historical logic of mutualizing premiums and risks, seemingly without any major rupture change, even with the reform, in the way the problem is being addressed by authorities. So what evolves with the new maps is the ratio between collective and individual costs, a key parameter through which regulators approach insurance system. But the problem of who ought to bear the costs, collectively or individually, is also a key issue in all insurance system. It's also something we have in the very big debate about the reform of the retirement system. And I think both cases and different cases of insurance, they kind of point out to the fact that these state-led insurance systems that were built in the 20th century, they all show a really strong number of limits. Here, in the case of Underwater, due to the increase in flood risks and climate risks, in France for retirement and for retirement system in general, due to a disequilibrium in the share of retired and active people. But all of these points out to the fact that reforming insurance system, adapting them to the changing biophysical, ecological, demographic context is key, or maybe completely reforming them or getting rid of them is also something else, another discussion. So, but anyway, for this reason, I really believe that in-depth studies of our insurance systems are really essential to grasp their drift and their limitations. So maybe let me reflect further on this kind of public-private tension within insurance policy, which is also a key dimension of other researches on social states. I'm thinking about the work of Esping Anderson's on social states, where he is interested in this public-private tension not only as a ratio between collective and private costs, but also as the share of action and responsibilities delegated to the private sector. So this public-private ratio helps us unfolding what is solidarity in a given society and how it's expressed. I think it's worth reflecting on who falls in these public and private categories in the case of NFIP and FEMA. All along the book, we see that the federal states plays a key role in addressing the question of the economic equilibrium, but this public intervention is also criticized for the economic burden that it places on the shoulders of taxpayers. And at the other end of the spectrum are inhabitants, householders living in these flood risk areas, the insurance policy being based on their individual participations. So there's this kind of, taxpayers, households, and maybe what we see also in the book is how strongly individual landowners bear responsibility of the flood risk through paying premiums, but also managing their home locally. So as Rebecca writes in the introduction, calculated exposure to risk is something that inhabitants, in a sense, own and have to manage through a set of ostensibly rational strategies. All along the story, we also see how the situation, people living in risky low-plain areas, it stems from weak land regulations where municipalities, local governments, private estate companies, banks have facilitated and enabled dwelling in flood zones. While there is a diffuse and distributed responsibility of all these stakeholders in regard to the situation, individual landowners and private households, they end up bearing full responsibility of the situation. So, this also made me think about social scientists that wrote about how before social states and policies were in place, land ownership was one of the main source of protection. And here I'm referring to a French social scientist called Robert Castel. The situation has reversed with climate risk. Land does not confer security any longer, but still, as Katharina Pistor puts it, individual property rights, they remain one of the fundamental legal devices through which assets are coded. And yet, repeatedly in underwater, we understand that insurance, as a post-disaster management instrument, also bears a promise of regulating construction in flood zone, but it has always failed to do so, and maybe precisely because no construction stakeholders have ever bore any responsibility in the insurance system. In Chapter 4, Elliott highlights how the insurance policy was meant to go hand by hand with the regulation of the construction sector, but has always failed. So if I quote, Congress provided resources to strengthen enforcement of land use requirements and building codes. These measures address important and persistent implementation challenges, but it remains to be seen whether they can withstand the enduring pressure of local growth and development that have compromised such efforts in the past. So what we see here is how a local collective and diffuse responsibility for construction in risky areas is translated into an individual responsibility that lies on the shoulders of what we could call the final consumer of the construction sector, the landowner. The strength of the insurance policy lies at last resort on private ownership and private property in a context where construction is hardly regulated. This situation seems hardly resolvable without expanding the frontiers of responsibility, maybe to an intermediary level of local actors. And yet, I understand, reading the book, that this has never been the question. Even Stop FEMA Now activists never brought this as an option, if I get it well. Maybe not even merely as a criticism of the current system. I'd be happy to hear your thought on that, Rebecca. I wondered maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on this. Maybe about what it tells us about the strength of private ownership or individual responsibility in the USA, and maybe tell us if you've seen some signs of deconstruction of this strong belief at some point in your research. And And I don't know if I still have time, but this also made me think about the recent reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy that have enhanced the possibilities to both develop a private insurance market for climate and economic risks for farmers, but based on a tool that they call mutualization funds to allow the pooling of risk management and the integration of not only farmers, but only agricultural organizations and industries, for instance. And more generally, I think it's worth having different cases like flood insurance and landowners, climate insurance and farmers to push further reflection of how in systems where responsibilities are diffused, they come to be segmented, individualized, collectivized or not. Yeah, I'll skip that. Last, maybe I can highlight why Underwater is also an important book for economic sociology. I mean, here within this mini conference, what we also are trying to push forward is a reflection on what the discipline of economic sociology says and has said and also should say about climate and environmental problems. And together with the colleagues Ian Gray and Richard Walsh, with we organized this mini conference in the previous years, we've emphasized that environmental economic sociology is still an emerging field, and it's also a relevant one to think about climate disruption and environmental issues. For that reason, Rebecca's book is a great step in that direction. And most of the work currently in environmental economic sociology, I would say that most of the work currently concentrates on institutional initiatives to transition economies and to how to repair the damages done to the environment. But sociology and economic sociology still somehow lags behind in addressing the huge economic consequences on human activities that stem from climate disruption and the way societies need to adapt to these catastrophes. And so on this note, I think thinking about loss and not about repairing the environment, but also, managing loss, sheds light on the massive adaptation that societies carry out and will need to carry out in front of the rising economic damages occurring from climatic events. And for all these reasons, I think that Underwater is really a great book, and I hope that you will all read it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca.
Hello, I'm Caleb Scoville, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Tufts University. I'm excited to participate in this session not only because Underwater is a great book, but also because Rebecca was the first formal discussant I had on my work that would eventually become my dissertation and current book project. And this was when Rebecca was on her way out of UC Berkeley sociology program to start her job at LSE, and I was just getting my footing in grad school. And Rebecca's comments gave me a sense of direction at a critical juncture in my intellectual development. So it's really a privilege to have things come full circle in this way. So the title of Rebecca Elliott's Underwater is a hydrologic economic double entendre. Floodwaters may inundate a house, but the financial consequences of such storms or the anticipated risks thereof are dislocating in a sense that is less physical, but no less real. Rather than focusing on, quote, moments of acute and conspicuous destruction and loss, exemplified by neighborhoods being physically submerged, Elliott draws our attention to the, quote, before and after, and specifically the institution that manages loss and losses, inscribing disasters into the everyday realities of residents, communities, and governments, even in times of relative calm. That is insurance. As Elliott shows, flood insurance, which is the analytic focus of Underwater, has both linking and containing functions. So let's start with linking. In Elliott's words, flood insurance links loss, lives, and landscapes. It does so by way of economization. Hazards and decisions are, quote, rendered economic, formatted in ways that make things calculable, and people calculative. Physical changes, societal patterns of settlement and development, and individual choices about where to live, which structures to fortify, and how are drawn together through insurance rates, rate maps, and premiums. These devices objectify risks that are being amplified by climate change. The way flood insurance links loss, lives, and landscapes is not unidirectional. When an insurance rate map is drawn or redrawn, a homeowner may face the choice of either paying a radically higher premium or, as we heard, undergoing an expensive flood-proofing process. Given that the resale value of homes is also impacted by how they are zoned in insurance rate maps, relocating to higher and drier ground may prove even more economically difficult after reclassification, complicating the attempt to align economic incentives with flood risk. This problem illustrates the economic meaning of the book's title. While flood damages themselves may cause tremendous losses, policy seeking to proactively manage flood risk can put people's homes on the line, even financially underwater. In a society in which rising real estate values have been the main counterweight to stagnating middle-class wages, it is understandable why some of Elliott's interlocutors in the field found new flood maps to be, again I quote, scarier than another storm. That was linking. Now for containing. Elliott shows the contingency of attempts to contain flood risk within individual households. Flood insurance, as conceived in the USA's National Flood Insurance Program, is an institutional container for flood risk that locates it at the level of the individual household. The household is subjectivized as a specific kind of calculative and moral agent. The question of climate change preparedness is posed not so much in terms of collective determination, but of individual responsibility. Yet this container is imperfectly sealed. This is where a second hydrologic metaphor that does not appear in the book's title becomes relevant, the overflow, a term which Elliott borrows from Michel Collin. Much as physical containers can only contain so much and lose their ability to hold their contents when under pressure, Elliott writes that loss associated with floods and climate change overflows the narrow bounds of calculation framed by flood insurance. A powerful example that Elliott threads artfully through the book is a movement called Stop FEMA Now, which, I quote, took its grievances to Congress, earning the solidarity of some of the most progressive and conservative senators and representatives, end quote. The costly effects of instituting new flood maps overflowed the individualizing calculative rationality imposed on the household, sparking a collective mobilization predicated on solidarities among homeowners, facing steep increases in premiums. This overflow laid bare the contradictions inherent in the collectively induced but locally emplaced financial burdens associated with climate change. Elliott conceptualizes Stop FEMA Now as an accidental climate public. These publics, Elliott writes, unite people who may or may not care deeply about climate change per se, who may be otherwise at different ends of the political spectrum, but who share what it is they have to lose in a world of rising seas, devastating storms, shifting precipitation patterns, and widespread wildfires. While the politics of loss exemplified by Stop FEMA Now overflowed the narrow policy vision embodied in the National Flood Insurance Program, it remains shaped by its institutional origin in homeownership. For instance, it excluded renters, who also face climate change-induced losses, yet do not own the kinds of assets that the movement sought to defend. Through this analysis, Elliott expands the notion of climate politics beyond venues explicitly and self-consciously organized around climate change, whether at the level of international negotiations around greenhouse gas emissions or more localized struggles over urban decarbonization and adaptation. This is an urgent task, and Underwater provides an excellent example of how to do so. I also think it's worth considering how the book's analytical focus on homeownership and policy attempts to contain climate risk therein provides a very specific picture of the politics of loss that may not carry over neatly into other contexts. So consider how the politics of loss can look in the context of failing public infrastructure. Here's an example, an excerpt from an article published last year by Jefferson Public Radio in Southern Oregon. I quote, "Rising tensions in the Klamath Basin could come to a boil soon, as 2 Klamath Project farmers plan to breach the fenced headgates of the federal irrigation project's main canal and try to release water, likely triggering a standoff with the federal government. They are staffing a large canvas tent with volunteers from the local branch of People's Rights, a national organization formed in 2020 by militant activist Ammon Bundy. And they're trying to rally support." This is a quote from one of the farmers. "I'm planning on getting DC's attention. We're going to turn on the water and have a standoff." Federal officials announced last month that due to extremely low water levels in the upper Klamath Lake, they would retain what water is there to protect endangered fish species. This means no water will be released this season from the lake into the A Canal, the main channel that delivers irrigation water to the project. The farmers say they plan to enter the fenced area surrounding the head gates, which is topped with barbed wire and posted with keep out signs threatening criminal charges, end quote. At a certain level, this story bears a family resemblance to the one Elliott tells. Farmers find solidarity in climate-induced losses associated in this case not with flood, but with extreme drought. Yet whereas in the case of Stop FEMA Now, the individualizing logic of homeownership overflowed into a collective but nonpartisan mobilization targeting institutional politics. In the case of the Klamath farmers, members of a constituency that owes its very existence to federal water infrastructure defended their interest through anti-government vigilantism justified by appeals to individual rights. Cases like this highlight an aspect of the politics of loss that is less visible in the empirical context of underwater. That is, the politics of loss not only creates and reinforces solidarities that, however imperfectly, evince our mutual dependency, it can also stoke societal divisions, consolidating senses not only of us, but also of them. We've had glimpses of what this looks like recently in the United States. Shocking losses of life and property caused by freak ice storms in Texas in 2021 were blamed incorrectly on green energy by right-wing politicians and media elites. Those lies were strategic. They sought to blunt a progressive climate politics. In the words of Fox News' Tucker Carlson, quote, "A reckless reliance on windmills is the cause of this disaster. This shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America." Similarly, in my own research on water politics in California, a legally protected fish called the Delta smelt has been mobilized by right-wing demagogues in ways disconnected from its actual impacts on water policy because its small size and lack of charisma has made it an ideal symbolic vessel for the message that an imagined they, smug liberal environmentalists in faraway cities, care more about, quote, their stupid little fish, as it was dubbed on the House floor in Congress, than ordinary people like you. In such cases, we can see how real losses associated with climate change, whether acute disasters or slow-moving resource depletion, can be perversely exploited by climate change denialists and defenders of fossil fuel interests to undermine the very solidarity that would be needed to tackle those problems. And what has the COVID-19 pandemic been, other than an extended period of loss with a concomitant politics marked by increasingly extreme division? Reactions to pandemic-related restrictions, and more recently soaring inflation and gas prices, provide cautionary tales for advocates of policies that would put the costs of a green energy transition on the backs of individuals who may be receptive to a politics of us versus them. Thus, as I see it, the challenge of the politics of loss turns not only on finding ways of overcoming the individualizing tendencies of our political economy, as is emphasized in Underwater, but also making sure that what we collectively stand to lose is not eclipsed by the affective divisions that have come to dominate so much of our politics today. This is consonant with the lessons of Underwater, which shows why biophysical changes associated with climate change cannot be easily cordoned off from the rest of our politics. Yet while one of Elliott's stated ambitions is to move the sociology of climate change beyond the traditional emphasis of subdisciplinary environmental sociology, I think continuing to develop the sociology of loss in additional analytical contexts is one promising way to build bridges between traditional environmental sociology and other subfields. Specifically, considering how the politics of loss may overflow into the broader politics of strategic division may be a helpful way to move the analysis of climate change denial beyond narrow interest group and public opinion-based explanations. Anticipating, explaining, and channeling overflows may turn out to be an important role for sociologists of climate change, who can uncover the true stakes of environmental controversies and chart the path towards strategies that will help us build a climate politics that, to invoke Elliott's words, recognizes our fates as connected. Thank you.
the original plan was like 10 minutes of response between you and the panelists, Rebecca. So between, I think, 5-10 minutes, because I'd like to leave time for Q&A for the audience. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for these brilliant comments and provocations. I've written out kind of lengthy responses to each of you. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to try to deliver them, my response in a more kind of synthetic fashion. And then you can certainly kind of keep in touch to talk at greater length if there's interest. But because I think in some ways, like, all of the comments are driving at the peculiarity, the idiosyncrasy perhaps of a couple things, of homeownership and the problem of property, and as well as insurance, right? Is there something that's kind of peculiar about insurance? And I think in some ways that the politics surrounding insurance generally, and the NFIP more specifically, are so fractious and dysfunctional maybe, because people have been expecting insurance to be capable of doing too much. So, in the first place, a number of sociologists of insurance have shown that economists tend to overestimate the incentive effects of insurance. It's not quite the nudge that we imagine it to be. But the logic is nevertheless so persistently alluring to policymakers. It keeps being held up as a solution of kinds. And there's fabulous work by Lee Johnson, a geographer at Oregon, about how it is that even in the face of kind of consistent failures to deliver on its sort of risk-reducing missions, people keep turning to insurance as though it's going to help us get there. And of course, Beth Pop-Berman's new book will help us to understand that allure even better. But I mean, that's, but I think the problem that all three of the comments are really kind of pointing to, beyond just sort of the functional limitations of insurance, is this political question of, what is the world that we want to create? And what is the role, if any, that insurance might play in it? Because, as we face further climate change, we want people to have safe and affordable housing, whether they own that housing or not. We also want people to know something about the hazards they face so that they can prepare for them. And I think in some ways the problem is that we've been relying on the NFIP and on other kinds of insurance institutions to do both things. And importantly, to do them by relying on a price mechanism to nudge individuals, when we could be using insurance as a concept to think about a bigger question, which is, in a world where we agree that we want both of those things, we want to kind of know, we want information about risk, and we want people to live safe and secure lives. How are we going to share risk and responsibility? That's kind of the core question. And so I think the limits of the NFIP, or the kind of pain points where we see it break down, are coincident with the limits of private property as a pathway to economic security. Because, no matter what happens to the NFIP, some areas will be, or already are becoming, physically uninhabitable. Property values in those areas are going to zero, and they will never recover. So, you can disclose all the risk you want, but then what? That's the question. Wealth is wiped out. So indeed, we need much bigger ideas. We need much more transformative visions to deal with that problem. And that's not a problem that a new rating algorithm or mapping methodology is going to deliver. Though FEMA is still trying because they've just issued guidance for a new rating algorithm that they promise is going to fix all the problems of flood insurance. And then I want to pick up on kind of two other things that came up in the comments. And the first is Max's point about race, and I think this is a really important one. Because of course we know that exposure to flood risk is racially patterned. We also know that post-disaster resources have kind of stratifying effects that kind of reinscribe patterns of marginalization. Low-income residents, communities of color aren't able to kind of avail themselves of the resources to rebuild or to relocate. And we know this from work on buyouts, as kind of racialized projects of social mobility. Work by Jim Elliott and co-authors, no relation of mine actually. But Max has also asked this kind of more fundamental question about the kind of racial logics at embedded in flood insurance. And this is indeed something that I've been thinking about, and I think if I were to revise the book, something I'd spend some more time on, because I was rereading John Robinson's fantastic piece about the constitutive whiteness of credit. And it got me thinking about, is there a constitutive whiteness of the NFIP? Because you can't really separate the development of flood insurance in the period in which it was developed, which was, the intellectual work was really happening in the 1950s and 1960s, and it was part of a major kind of housing bill in 1968, from these mid-century narratives of normative whiteness, as Keeanga-Yamada Taylor puts it. The NFIP came into existence at a moment where there was a huge push to expand homeownership in the post-war period, and that was a racially exclusionary project. But I think, this question of exclusion also, connects to the provocations that Caleb was offered on the politics of loss, where the other kinds of boundaries that might be set can also have to do with us and them, what he calls these affective divisions. And so I think hold on, let me pull up the notes I have here. Yeah, so the kind of direction of travel of the politics of loss, I think, what Caleb has suggested is that the circumstances will be kind of empirically variable, it'll be contingent on the interest relations and longer histories of people and places. So, in his example from the Klamath Basin, the particular contingencies there militate in the direction of individual rights and establish fault lines between us and them. In a context where, in the case of flood insurance, actually, government critical constituencies are created by government action. And the example of right-wing smears of green energy highlights another key point, I think, that, climate change is not just a bundle of physical changes to the world, but it's also a discursive resource. It's enlisted to make divergent, sometimes contradictory sets of claims about what exactly is going on around us, what is being lost and why, who is winning and losing, these types of things. And so I think this is why we need to be attentive to the potential for kind of new claims, new realignments in the politics that will shape a climate changed US. Losses are material, but I think what Caleb's examples point us to are the fact that they're not self-evidently connected to anything in particular, independent of the sayings and doings of people. So they can be drawn in and they can be tethered to what Caleb characterizes as these affective divisions that define contemporary American politics. And perhaps more often that than the alternative, which would be to overcome them. And so I'm really going to be mulling over Caleb's points here in the context of some new projects that I'm working on related to climate adaptation infrastructure. And I think this also speaks to some of Stephanie's points about, regulating construction and broader senses of responsibility, because here, decisions about where to put a seawall or how long to make it or what it ought to protect often start from a sense of collective endeavor, this idea that, we have to protect our community. But as plans proceed, they're often riven by these affective divisions and kind of histories of racial exclusion, with new and often kind of competing characterizations of who is the us and who is the them. So even, these efforts, as Stephanie puts it, to kind of broaden responsibility, still are kind of working with these fault lines that shape how they are pursued, how these projects are pursued. So yeah, like I said, there's more to say, but I will leave it there for now.
All right, well, do you have any responses? We can do that now.
I have. I just had one thought about something you just said, Rebecca, which is, and it goes to Caleb's points too, about this notion of us versus them as kind of lens or a perspective, right, through which to view the politics of projects, whether they're development projects or mitigation projects. There was a lot of reporting after those big fires in Colorado last summer outside of Boulder, and these were, relatively liberal in the like American political sense suburbs where these houses got razed. Before the fires, however, they had recently passed local building rules to mitigate against carbon emissions, to make home construction somewhat more burdensome, but at least sort of more environmentally friendly. And what I remember about the reporting was that all of these good liberals, right, who had just had their houses burned, were now mad at their own local governments for having more regulation on rebuilding. And so what I was thinking about in this terms of this sort of like us versus them question, what climate change is doing is also creating sort of us versus us, or contradictory positions, right, within the same group, within the same people, about when and why they're able to make particular claims about righteousness, right? And so, before they're affected, right, the righteous thing to do is to make, environmentally conscious decisions about building, which are going to be good for the environment, right? But once my home is actually razed and I have to rebuild it, or damaged and I have to rebuild it, I want to be left alone and not have to spend more money, in these burdensome environmental ways. So it was just something that crossed my mind, right? Because I don't think it's again, I think this us versus them is a very good lens, but the them these are shifting, constantly shifting who is us and who is them. I think that's what the study of global warming, right, climate change disasters actually sort of does, is illuminate the really unstable positions, right, that people might have about all these, kinds of things that we're talking about right now.
Hi, Rebecca. Can you hear me? This is Ian. Yeah, hi. I'll ask quickly my two questions because I want other people to have time to ask questions also. But first, the book is amazing, and it's such a pleasure to read. The way you transition from article-style writing to a really engaging and publicly oriented book, I think is fabulous. And I know you and I have talked about that a little bit. So kudos to you on that transition. So two questions. I wonder whether it might be interesting to think about a comparative moral economy of insurance or climate change. And I know you live in England now. I live in France. And property insurance is structured very, very differently in both countries. And from your book, I learned that the NFIP originally was created not with the intention of being a long-lasting public insurance option, but as a kind of a structure to help build a private market in flood insurance, which, for many reasons that you discuss in the book, had a hard time kind of managing the risks from some major floods that occurred in the 60s and prior to that. So in England, I know the state works kind of more hand in hand with private insurers to do this kind of infrastructure, assure that there's infrastructure that can protect against flood events, particularly in flooding. And so there's kind of I don't know if you call it a public-private partnership aspect or kind of a gentleman's agreement or something. I don't know that much about it, so maybe you could describe more. And in France, the disasters, there's a pool for disaster insurance where multiple disasters are covered by the same premium. So there's a fee on everybody's home, and if there's a big fire disaster, or if there's a flood disaster, or whatever it might be, the government declares a disaster, and everybody has access to the fund. And so I wonder whether there's just the obstacle of the lack of imagination in America about what the state could actually require of insurance, or how it might reinforce the incapacities of insurance to think longer term. And so that's one question, is this kind of comparative moral economy. And the second is more related to something I've been thinking about ever since I watched these homes off the coast of North Carolina kind of tip into the ocean, right? If you've seen these videos, there were some high tides in North Carolina, and homes built as close as they could to the edge of the water before sea level rise started happening. And you watch these two homes just kind of tilt over and wash out into the sea. And so I'm wondering about the costs of private property to the public. And those cases are kind of marginal because the ocean is large and it'll probably digest these homes and spew them out across the beach and they can be cleaned up. But in places like Florida, where you have thousands of homes that are disconnected from public infrastructure and have all built septic tanks to kind of, contain their own little fiefs, once saltwater intrusion starts happening, you're going to have thousands and thousands of septic tanks, blowing up and polluting public waterways. And so insurance is not designed to think about the costs of private property to the larger public. And this is going to be a growing problem with all sorts of these disasters. And so, and also for corporate infrastructure, abandoned wells and things like that. So I'm wondering, how do we start thinking more about the costs of private property under conditions of climate change to society? So.
I'll keep it brief. Yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, I live in England, so this has been a really interesting comparative case. And I mean, one of the kind of most salient differences is that in England, where, as in the US, flooding is the most costly kind of natural hazard, there exists currently a cross-subsidy, basically, where people who live at low risk subsidize people who live at high risk. It works out because flood insurance is kind of a much more common part of homeowners insurance. I think it works out to about 11 pounds per policy, and people just don't mind. It's just not. It's not a kind of political problem, that cross subsidization in the UK the way that it is in the US. This idea that like I shouldn't have to, support people who live near the water doesn't kind of prevail in England in quite the same way. Nevertheless, the current direction of travel of flood insurance in the UK is towards a more kind of free market model where that cross subsidy will disappear. But the expectation, this kind of gentleman's agreement between the private industry and the state is that the state will build a lot of flood defense infrastructure to bring that kind of risk down so that it's not unaffordable to insure anymore. But this, Brett Christophers has done some work on these plans. They're kind of long on ambition, short on detail, and it's not at all clear that we will get to this world in the kind of timeline that's been set out. I mean, my view about absolutely. I mean, this idea of what the state could be doing. I think. I mean, why not make flood insurance a mandatory part of every homeowner's policy? Because we already know that a lot of floods happen outside of the bounds of traditional flood zones. Floods happen not just as the result of, what we might associate with climate change, but also like pumps explode. Things break down in ways that that cause flooding. Why don't we spread the risk across every single property, in the US, and that would kind of bring the cost down for everyone. In terms of the cost of public property, I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that's so funny to me about the NFIP is that it's often singled out as something that is kind of providing undue support to some homeowners, when in fact it's just one small piece of an entire suite of public policy that is about important homeowners. So much of American public policy is designed to shore up private property and to make it possible for people to, purchase what is essentially a wooden box that like rots on a piece of land. So it's not, but it's the NFIP that's kind of the political punching bag. When you're absolutely right, like there are all these ways in which private property is a kind of fiscal burden to everyone, even people who do not own private property.
Next two we'll do together, so yeah.
Hi, Rebecca. First of all, my name is Mark Hudson. I'm from the University of Manitoba in Canada. I'm one of those bad participants who hasn't actually read the book yet, but I'm a little fanboyish right now because of your original article on sociology of loss, which has been a big inspiration to some of my work. I have a question, I guess, that I think connects to some of the issues that Stephanie's raised around a kind of a distractionary tendency, I think, that may be active. And I certainly see this in reactions to forest management and fire management, which is an area in which I've done work. So I wonder if you might comment on the extent to which objects like premium rates and hazard maps and the agencies that generate those maps produce a kind of a red cape for an angry public that distracts them from other kinds of more deeper kinds of issues, questions about private property, questions about the extent to which we might actually come up with collective forms of responsibility, questions about who's responsible for climate change in the first place. So the state becomes a kind of a convenient target, I think, for a lot of movements, when in fact my sense is that one of the dynamics that's happening is that the state is a kind of a perpetual manager of crises that are generated by capitalism, economic crises, ecological crises, et cetera. So I wonder if you think you might comment a little bit on the politics of anger at things or objects like rates or maps and the agencies that generate them versus, I think, a more productive and justified anger at the original generators of climate change. Thank you.
All right, and we have 3 now. A lot of interest.
Hello, Rebecca. This is Daniel Beunza from City University in London, so you're a London neighbor. I have a question about the book that my reading is perhaps complementary to the wonderful analysis done by the panelists. To me, the book is unique and exceptional in that it anticipates other ways in which climate change is being economized. And so what I'd like to do is take the conversation slightly away from insurance and take it into other realms. So at least in my reading, one potential way of thinking about your book is that it shows that it calls into question the entire climate risk project. That is the idea of using the price mechanism to address climate change via increased individual costs. So this is something that now is being done in financial markets, and companies are being asked to disclose their climate risks, and central bankers are asking banks to conduct climate stress tests. So clearly this is a different industry from the one that you have focused on. I'm wondering what the message would be for those industries outside home insurance.
All right, we have a 3rd question on here as well, and I think we started 15 minutes late. So Rebecca, if you're able to stay like 5 to 7 minutes later, is that okay? Okay.
Hey, this is Dan Staub from Brooklyn College and CUNY Grad Center. Way to lead with the Rockaways, by the way. That was cool. My question kind of is semi-related. I always came to flood insurance in perhaps a different way than most sociologists, in as much as I was a bank finance attorney. And so for me, it was not an individual enterprise. It was that protected individual homeowners. It was an enterprise that protected banks, right? The mortgage bank that required it as a condition for 2 reasons. 1, to limit their own risk, and 2, for all important access to pooling, right? Mortgage-backed securities markets, derivatives markets. You can't pool a mortgage if it doesn't have the check mark. So I was wondering if you wanted to think about, and somewhat related to the question immediately before, is framing it as an individual enterprise complementary, or should we complement it by framing it as kind of a global markets and securities enterprise that, who does it really protect? And related to the question before, what does that mean for things like bank stress tests and securities market stress tests, that the underlying assets are protected or not?
It's all you.
Great. Thank you for these questions. This first question about, is the kind of focus on an insurance premium or a risk map a kind of distraction from bigger issues? I mean, I think yes, and I mean, here I'll kind of paraphrase a colleague, Andy Horowitz, who's a historian at Tulane, who's written this kind of magisterial book on Katrina. And, he points out that, I mean, perhaps we are so obsessive about things like flood insurance because our democratic institutions are so atrophied that we can't actually have the civic conversations that we need to have about the future of where people are going to live and who's going to have to pay for it, and these kinds of huge questions. So to the extent that it feels impossible to have those kind of bigger conversations, this is really, pointing to the kind of limitations of American democracy in the current moment. And then the questions about kind of the larger sort of financial system. I mean, here again, I'm gonna refer to work of colleagues. I've learned everything I've learned about kind of insurance-linked securities, catastrophe bonds. I've learned from work by Zach Taylor, who's a geographer at TU Delft, and Stephen Collier and Savannah Cox, who've done some work on private financing of public resilience measures. And also actually Ian Gray, who's in the room with you right now. Because I think you're right. I think there's a huge world of ways in which climate change is being economized. I think economic sociologists need to study all of them. And the example of kind of stress tests and disclosures, I think, is a great one. I think there's a lot more that we need to understand about how that works. I mean, in the case of kind of the banks and what they're kind of getting out of not just flood insurance, but insurance generally, what Zach's work has shown is that by turning kind of risk into an asset that can be kind of shifted onto global capital markets, this has allowed for the kind of continued profitable underwriting of risky developments, and he focuses on the Florida case, which is we might expect like that this is the first place that insurers are going to abandon. To the contrary, there's a lot of building in Florida, including in some of its most risky geographies, precisely because insurers and financial actors are so good at kind of pushing out at the limits of their own risk knowledge, of their own kind of commercial practice, in order to find new products, new ways to continue to kind of package commoditized risk. So, these are kind of frontiers where I think there's a lot more work to be done, certainly not just by myself, but hopefully by a whole community of people who are going to be interested in the interface of climate change and finance and economic systems more generally.